Hello, and welcome to Serpentine on this really beautiful summer's evening. I hope you're not too hot. There were some paper fans being distributed, so if you haven't got one and need one, please go and find one of the members of staff, and they'll give one to you. I'm Lizzie Carey-Thomas, Director of Programmes and Chief Curator at Serpentine. And it's wonderful to see so many of you here for our special In Conversation event. And I'm especially pleased to be gathered in this year's pavilion, which has been designed by Lanza Atelier. They're a Mexico City-based practice, and this is the 25th pavilion in the annual commission, and the first to be built with brick. It's my great pleasure to introduce the artists Cecily Brown and Celia Paul, who'll be in conversation with me tonight, in conjunction with Cecily's exhibition Picture Making, which I hope you've all had an opportunity to see. But if you haven't, fear not. It's on till the 6th of September, so you've got a little bit of time left. Although their work is visually distinct, Celia and Cecily share a profound commitment to painting as a subject in and of itself. And this preoccupation underpins the ongoing dialogue between them, traces of which appear in a remarkable exchange of emails included in our exhibition catalogue. We're enormously grateful to both artists for their generosity in allowing us to witness that conversation both in the book and continue in public this evening. Over more than 3 decades, Cecily Brown has produced an incredible body of painting characterized by energetic brushwork, vivid color, and all-over compositions that draw the viewers into a space of active looking. Drawing on a wide range of visual sources, from the acknowledged icons of Western painting to children's book illustration, she engages in a continual play of revealing and concealing her subject. The productive tension between image and mark, subject and process, is central to her work. As she has commented, I don't have a message to get across, so the subject is always painting and how to push painting. I'm thoroughly absorbed by that. Born in London in 1969 and raised in Surrey, Cecily studied at the Slade School of Fine Art, London, graduating in 1993. During her studies, she took part in an exchange program at the New York Studio School, where she formed a deep affinity with the city and moved there in 1994, where she continues to live and work. Her work has been the subject of major recent exhibitions at the Dallas Museum of Art in Texas, the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, Museo Novecento and Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Pinakothek der Modern in Munich, and Louisiana Museum of Modern Art in Denmark. This picture making at Serpentine is Cecily's first major exhibition in a UK public institution since her exhibition at Modern Art Oxford just over 20 years ago. On to Celia. Celia Paul is celebrated for her intense contemplative paintings of the people and places to which she feels most deeply connected. Regardless of subject matter, her works possess a distinctive stillness, yet vibrate with an emotional intensity and psychological depth. Born in 1959 in Trivandrum, India, Celia moved to Britain at the age of 5 and, like Cecily, studied at the Slade, graduating in 1981. While still a student, she began a series of intimate portraits of her mother, who continued to sit for her for over 3 decades. More recently, her attentions have turned towards her sisters, the landscape, the sea, and her own identity through an extraordinary ongoing series of self-portraits, which are unflinching in their scrutiny, not of her likeness, but in trying to capture a sense of who she is in the present tense. Celia is also an acclaimed writer. Her autobiography, Self-Portrait, appeared in 2019, followed by Letters to Gwen John in 2022, in which she explores her affinity with the artist through an imagined correspondence. Her recent monograph, published by Victoria Mirror in collaboration with MAC, spans 50 years of work and includes her essay, Painting Myself, where she writes, "My young self and I, we are the same person. I can stretch out my old hand with its age spots and hold my young, unblemished hand. Painting myself might be like coming home." Celia has had recent solo exhibitions at Gladstone Gallery in New York, Sant'Andrea di Scafis, Rome, Victoria Mirror, London, Yale Center for British Art, Connecticut. I've got to the end of the list. There's many more, but let's stop there and get on with the conversation. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Cecily Brown and Celia Paul. So we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. So, Celia and Cecily, in the catalogue to picture making, we have included excerpts from your email correspondence, which began in 2024. And it's an incredibly rare and intimate glimpse into a conversation between two painters that ranges from artists you admire to artists you don't admire, to studio routines, the practicalities, and technical questions of painting. And I wanted to start by asking what prompted you to write to one another in this way, and what did these exchanges make possible that maybe a face-to-face exchange perhaps doesn't? Celia, can I start with you?
Well, it seemed quite natural when it happened. Cecily and I have first met, when was it, late 90s, in London. And I think although we lost touch for a long time, Cecily, she was always very much in my consciousness, to do with the commitment to painting, to the paint in itself. And so in November 2024, I was so excited to receive this beautiful postcard of the Velasquez, Philip Prosper, and with just an opening up of wanting to be in touch, and so it started from there.
We have a very good mutual friend or friends, British friends who live in New York. But I'd been aware of Celia's work for many, many years, but just somehow me being there and her being here, just never really happened. Can everyone hear? Okay. But the funny thing about the email exchange, if those of you have seen the catalogue, is, they're really like proper letters. And one thing that I thought when they were published was like, oh gosh, everyone I don't write to is going to think, where'd you find the time to write to her every day? But it just sort of took off, didn't it? And then it really became a friendship through the letters, to the point where we hadn't really, apart from that time 30 years ago, we met in person just last year and went to see some art together.
Yes, we did.
But just the friendship really developed over these emails. So, have a read if you haven't had a chance to.
Thank you. In your exchange and elsewhere, in fact, you've both been quite candid about the necessary solitude central to the painting process. The discipline and the daily grind of the painter grounded in the studio. That might sit a bit at odds with the romantic idea of a painter's life. And Celia, I was going to ask you, you've been based in the same Bloomsbury studio since 1982, so for over 40 years, and the interiors and exterior view from the studio often feature in your paintings. How important is the studio to your process, do you feel?
It's immensely important. I find it really difficult to paint anywhere else, actually. I think partly because I do work by myself in silence. The rooms have kind of acquired a kind of silence, haven't they, that it's difficult to describe because the outside is so noisy and you hear traffic sounds coming up from the street, but somehow the studio itself has retained this quietness, and I think it's partly because so many people have sat for me in silence in the space that it's affected the air and atmosphere, which I don't think I could replicate anywhere else immediately anyway.
But you have managed to work in Venice, for example.
Yeah.
Which surprised me, because I thought after being in one place for so long, I know you've did a residency in Venice a couple of times, haven't you? And that I would have thought, how did you know you were going to be able to work there?
Well, I didn't know. It was a huge risk. But
did your gallery know what a risk it was? Did they know? What would have happened if you'd got there and not been able to paint? Would it have been all right?
Well,
I think they were quite generous. I think they thought, why wasn't I having more fun and going out for aperitivos and things? But no, I think partly I set myself a discipline of going to the studio every day, so it became a kind of ritual for when I was there. And strangely, the studio, Victoria Miro, has this great studio space in Venice that looks directly onto the Giudecca Canal. And there are the boats passing, Vaporetto boats passing all the time, and it so strangely echoes my studio in London, with its view onto the forecourt of the British Museum and the tourists, and this kind of dramatic view which I connected to but separate from, and the sort of distant sound of tourists. That so it felt oddly like being at home.
do you think you almost need a sense of busyness outside the studio in order for you to find the right headspace to be able to work? Would it be the same if you were in the countryside, for example?
I mean, I often fantasize about being in the countryside, because central London is becoming quite, at times, nightmarishly busy. And but what I love doing is just to kind of dream up the countryside in my central London studio, and I feel that there's a kind of longing that comes into my landscapes and seascapes, which conjured up in central London because I'm not actually there. And if I was actually there, maybe they would become smug and look how, I don't know, it would have, I think the yearning might not be there.
That's a really good bridge to talk to you, Cecily, because of course you haven't been in the same studio, but you have been in Manhattan for 30 years. And actually, I've often been thinking about how it must have felt to be making the body of work that we're showing here, much of which relates to your memories of growing up in the Surrey countryside. And how important is it to you where you're located? How does that influence your process?
I mean, I've only really ever painted in New York since I left art school. So I would love to try and paint in England at some point. But again, I don't think I'd paint green and pleasant lands if I was here. But I don't really know. But it sounds so sort of naive, but it didn't really strike me till we were working on this show together that how funny it was that I'd been in Manhattan for so long and painted the countryside so often and made so many paintings related to nature and about gardens and landscape. But again, I think, they're never of a specific landscape. They are very much about memory and yearning and longing and missing and sort of... It's funny, actually, Hervin Anderson's show that's on at Tate Britain, I can't remember if it was one of my nieces or just a friend who said, oh, I was reading all about how him not saying about displacement and not really quite knowing where home was, or if it's Birmingham, England, Jamaica, or what. And I do think painting is this extraordinary... It's a very good place to talk about longing and memory and, that sort of not uncertainty of place. I suppose because you're inventing a new place, aren't you? But I feel the same way of just sort of not quite knowing where I'm from, where I belong, not quite knowing where home is, having this great longing for England, but then when I'm here thinking, I don't really know where I am, I don't quite recognise it, and I don't quite know where I fit. But I think as a painter, I mean, perhaps that's the same for a lot of people, and at least if you're a painter, you can make your own place within the work. But yeah, I'm in a temporary studio at the moment, and I loved it at first. I sort of hit the ground running and started all these things, but I've actually been really struggling to paint the last few months. So probably I'm more of a creature of habit than I realise.
Well, maybe that's a good segue to talk about nature a bit. We're sitting here surrounded by Kensington Gardens. It seems an appropriate place to talk about it, and it's a subject that relates to both of your work in very different ways. Celia, you've spoken about coming to painting through looking at nature as you were growing up on the North Devon coast and being compelled to make paintings in order to try and engage with it. And Cecily, you've described your paintings of nature as a site to work on memory. I wondered if you could both talk about your relationship, or each talk about your relationship to nature a little bit more. Do you want to start?
I mean, growing up we grew up near Box Hill, which, if you haven't been there, you just picture sort of Emma, the Jane Austen, it's the most beautiful green belt, isn't it? Is it the green belt? Yeah, it's Surrey countryside. Really lovely. And of course, being little, didn't really think of it that much. But now, when I go back there, I just think how extraordinary to have had this as a backdrop to our childhood. But it was that typical 70s childhood that everyone sort of talks about, with all the freedom and disappearing off on your bike for hours and a rope over the stream and all that sort of thing. So I think early childhood and those experiences, I mean, it's one of those things that it's impossible to say for sure what your influences are and what formed you. But I, think the early years of running around, probably our garden seemed huge. Of course, it was probably tiny, but, just that sense of being a child in the country, and it's very sort of idyllic, really, where my early childhood was. But I think, yeah, it's so hard to dissect your own or analyse your own story, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, we were just talking inside about India and your very early memory, like in your pram.
Yes.
Imagine the colours and things you must have seen and the light when you were a baby.
Yes. No, I mean
I was a baby in London, so, but then I was in Surrey from age 2.
Yeah, and I think those early memories become more intense as you get older. There's this sort of cycle, this feeling of the return. It comes back, and I think it's becoming more and more intensely important to me now. And my first memories are of nature in India, and very specific visual memories of, we had this beautiful garden. We lived in Kerala, which is very south of India, and just very lush and intense light. And I think light is so important, and every space, every country, every county has its own particular light, which affects everything.
Well, you're really good on light. We've talked about this. I mean, I think light is the hardest thing for me. I don't think I understand light. I mean, I was at the Slade at a time when we didn't really get taught painting in any sort of formal way. So I think if there's one thing I wanted to would go to an art class for, it was like to study light and shadow, because I've never really understood it, but I know it when I see it. Like if you're somewhere with very beautiful light, like you go to New York. I mean, I was attracted to New York's light really above all else, and it reminded me of sort of Italian light. And I remember thinking, if New York doesn't work out, I'll go and live in Naples, because I'd been there just before and loved it. And it's got a similar very, that very clear, amazing. And then, of course, England, sorry. And I know it's really hot now, but it is really a struggle to live here because of the lack of light, which I know, and I'm sorry that you all do it. But I find that incredibly challenging. And I think is one of the reasons whenever I think, God, I'd love to live in England again, and I just think, I don't know if I could take the weather. But, I mean, weather's sort of a thing of the past now, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. But then we did have a very long, very wet winter, didn't we? Cold.
I mean, we had a horrible winter in America, so apart from everything else horrible, needless to say. But shadows, just to say, from light, and then you have shadows, and
can I say about what you said about, because one of the Cecily sent this very beautiful email to me recently, talking about light and shadow, and you said that you were stuck in this traffic jam in a taxi, and you were looking out of the window, and you saw this very skinny tree with hardly any branches and looking so kind of desolate, but behind it, there's suddenly this shadow of the tree putting on this extraordinary display, you said, with the leaves moving as though it was kind of alive, had a life of its own. And it was quite a mystical experience. And I think one of the things I love about your paintings is the kind of intertwining of shadow with colour, so that the whole thing is kind of flickering between the life and of light and shadow.
Well, thank you. And obviously, I've always been very interested in movement and getting a certain movement into the paintings. And we've also talked about, the challenge for me is to do something still, because at this point, I think one of the reasons I'm struggling a lot with my work at the moment is sort of wanting to do something antithetical and to sort of feel, okay, there is movement. I feel like I can do that now, but could I paint something still? And I find it almost impossible. But the incident with the tree really was this sort of revelation of, and I think the sun must have come out, or someone turned a light on, and it just went from thinking like this poor, sad little tree, like the Christmas tree in Charlie Brown, suddenly it wasn't the tree itself, but the tree's shadow was this full of life, and but then it made me start thinking about shadows in art and how, I look at so much abstract art and thinking how shadows became completely verbatim. Is that the right word? Verboten, right? If you think of shadows, you don't really see shadows after the beginning of the 20th century. And I suppose it's to do with flatness and Japanese prints and, what everyone was influenced by. But I always find it interesting to think of the roads that weren't taken by painting because, up until the 50s, let's say, it was sort of this march of, things always seemed to be reacting to the last thing and marching forward. And then probably since the 70s or so, we haven't, in painting, we've just been sort of flailing around with some good people in there. But, if you think, but, I mean, obviously you couldn't be a cubist. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe there are a few shadows in cubism, obviously by abstract expressionism, like a shadow would be the corniest thing you could possibly do, or in English painting too. I mean, I think Bacon probably played with a sort of reflection, or Bacon probably played with a shadow in a sort of Eliot-esque way.
Yes, and that's the painting of the Van Gogh going to work.
Okay, so Bacon still did. But I always think of Bacon as an old master rather than a modern painter anyway.
Yeah.
But so I've started thinking, and I think in some of the paintings in the first room of the nature walks, you know, the revelation, the shocker to me was putting these shadows in. And you know the whole story about this log, right? And just wanting to do something really specific for once, to force myself to be less all over and to be less ambiguous, and to say, right, it's a picture of this specific thing, which I often start with a specific thing, but I let it then go. So I wanted to keep bringing it back to that thing. And then by just putting the shadow on the water, for me, and any painter knows, you can do something in the studio that seems like this massive leap to yourself, and of course the rest of the world barely blinks or notices it. But if you look again at those pictures in the first couple of rooms, yes, the log has a shadow, and I'd never really done that before.
And we were talking about reflections as well, weren't we,
Yes.
just now, and about how extraordinary puddles are when they reflect. They can reflect. They're like a whole world reflecting. And it's a bit like when you frame things off, that a puddle itself is almost like a framed painting, a whole world encapsulated in a frame.
And again, with the sort of longing, you'd sort of see this idealized world in a puddle. And perhaps because it's unexpected, but, you know, to see the blue sky and clouds in this sort of, it is like a picture painting, the way it just, you know.
And I suddenly saw all your paintings as puddles, kind of like worlds.
We were looking at the painting Terry and Julie, and there's my favourite part of it is the sort of puddle at the front, or foreground.
But it's also always strikes me with that, the puddle there, and also there's some water in around Robin when you first come in. It's like, what is it about that immediately you know that that's a reflection, that's water? Because if you break it down to its component parts in the context of your paintings, which are not narrative, there's not, apart from maybe the nature walk paintings, there's not a subject necessarily that's immediately discernible, but those patches are unquestionably reflections, and I still can't quite figure out why that is, why you read them so clearly as that.
Well, actually, our mutual friend Angus Cook, who's a writer and poet, he'd written an essay about my work many years ago, and he quotes, I'm going to embarrass myself and not remember the poet's name, but he quotes this wonderful poem about a puddle. And I think it's one of those things where a writer puts into words something that you're trying to do, but then it actually sparks more work. So I think, and it's something about, oh God, I wish he was here. In other worlds, it's sort of this idea of this encapsulated other world that you can see but not get to. But then I think I'm always also drawn to reflections in other people's work, like in Degas. One of my favourite Degas is this fairly obscure one that's in the Brooklyn Museum of a horse and figures. It's sort of quite classical. But it's because you see the subject. I think we're so hardwired. You look at, you know, sort of ostensible subject, and then you don't really realise that there's this whole other world to the painting that the painter knew and meant. And partly they're just cleverly using it to direct your eye. But you don't necessarily notice the reflection at first, and then you realise that it's the most important part of the painting in a way, and that the horse's subject is sort of halfway up the canvas, and at least half of it is taken by the reflection, but you don't.
And I think part of that as well is the specific quality of painting, which you actually need time to look at a painting. A real painting, you don't just see it and pass on. You actually have to give time to it, because every painting takes time, has time worked into it. And I think that's such an important thing always to remember.
I was actually looking at the Raphael show that's up in New York at the moment, and they have a tapestry, you know, and at the V&A they have the Raphael cartoons, and my favourite one was always the fishers, and there's extraordinary fishermen leaning over the water. But I think that might be where my thing with reflections really started, because the reflection, you know, because it's so abstract, and you think in the olden days, you know, painters had to find sort of ways to be, they were always interested in abstraction, but the subject was a given, and they were all commissioned, so that's in a way I think why one is often drawn to older art, because they had to kind of sneak in the real subject, or you sort of, it's like there are clues to what they were really interested in, because obviously he was told you've got to do these 12 paintings, but it's in the sort of almost subterfuge or sneaking in these other elements. And everything's upside down, of course, and inverted, and that in itself is it's somehow more moving.
Maybe that's a good point to ask you about this sort of the relationship between structure and freedom necessary to the painting process. And you know, it's something again you return to quite often in your correspondence, this relationship between getting the balance between discipline and freedom. And that painting seems to require an extraordinary amount of structure and routine and repetition. But within that, there's the kind of infinite possibility. Within the parameters you set, there's infinite possibility. And I wondered, you know, it's one of the very few mediums where I think it represents the world, but it can represent the world in a sort of figurative way, but then it also remains insistently physical as matter moved around a canvas by a body and a mind. And I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about the relationship between control and spontaneity in your process. Celia, do you want to start?
For me, so often I have to destroy what I've just made, and I don't set out to destroy it. Every time I start again, I put my whole soul into it, and then somehow, if the whole thing doesn't work as a whole, you can't just fiddle. Or, you know, you said you can't fix things and so you just have to be ruthless and get rid of the whole thing, because and it notches up the sense of crisis as well. And I feel that some of the best paintings, or some of my own best paintings, have come out through this extreme sense of crisis, that I've just destroyed something I was really proud of, and there's no way I'm going to get it back. But in trying to do that, something else happens that's somehow outside of myself.
Do you think in a way it's a cataclysm that frees something up inside you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you can't be too precious about painting. It just stifles it. And the one thing a painting has to have is energy. It can be very still energy, but it has to be alive.
But you can't force it to be alive, which is the nightmare, you know. And you don't know, even after all this time painting, you know, you can sort of tell when something's working and you can tell when it's not working, but it's really hard to always figure out why. I mean, I know this, everyone knows this, and everyone who's painted knows, but it's so often not the thing that you think is holding it back that is. So it's hard when you've worked on something for many months and you know you've got to still go in with the same level of risk and, you know, be willing to lose it, because you really can, you know, and that's the whole taking it too far. But, you know, on the other hand, you're worried that you haven't taken it far enough. So, I mean, I've played a lot in the last couple of years with faster paintings, and sort of the idea that you don't necessarily improve things just by doing more to them, and often they get worse and worse and worse. But it's also true that maybe some of the best ones, they get worse and worse and worse, and then they do get better again.
Yeah, that's so exciting when that happens, isn't it?
But it's, and I don't know if people, like young artists, realise this, that even at our age, you still don't know. You know, like I'll leave the studio thinking I've had the most horrible day, and really not knowing. And people say, "Oh, how do you not know? You've got a show at Serpentine, or you did this or that." And it's like, I still don't know from day to day whether something's good or not. I mean, I can guess, but, you know, leading up to this show, I was in agonies of hating everything, wasn't I? Probably not supposed to say that. But because you just, and I think I'm very superstitious of anything, you know, you have to be a bit in love with it to say it's finished, or like you're going to stop, which I prefer to say stop rather than it's finished, and know the right moment to stop working on it. But there's always that thing, could I have taken it further? And is it good enough? Is it good enough? And so when you first leave something, you obviously like it enough to say, right, it's done. And it's not always, I think this is good now. It's, I can't do any more to this, right? Yeah. But then, this is the terrible thing about showing, because I think my worst doubts start creeping in sort of 6 months to a year after that. Whereas when things are older, like I'll see something from 20 years ago and be able to say, oh, I like that. But with recent things, you're just in this agony of doubt that doesn't go away the older you get at all. And you just start thinking, oh, the people who say it's good are just bloody fools. What? Like, you know, it's really hard to know. And it's hard to also know who to listen to. And it's hard to know what you think yourself. And also, sometimes you can't tell till much later anyway. Yeah. But I mean, the idea that you're just going to get better and better over time as well just isn't true. So, you know, sometimes I'll look at things I did when I was really young, and I know that in some ways they're stronger than things I do now, because you were doing things for the first time, and when you're first discovering things, you can't recreate that. But, you know, you hope something else comes into it, like wisdom and maturity. But there's some, arguably, you know, technically, my early paintings, you know, I can find fault in them, you know, in the paint handling and so on, and maybe they're cracking more, but you can't, like, fake that verve and discovery from when you're young. I think it's a bit more like being an athlete than people realise, in a way, and that those moments, you know, talking of football, you know, you're Harry Kane, you know, you do it once, and you're waiting for that moment, really, of like, that's why you have to be there for all those hours and hours and hours when it's not going that well, and you're just doing the sort of jogging up and down or whatever, in the hope that, you know, you're going to score at the World Cup final. No, not.
But it's also interesting that you don't necessarily trust that instinct that you have reached that point.
I don't. Do you?
And you have to put it aside and wait and come back to it. Do you feel the same, Celia?
Well, it's so unpredictable. I think for me, when I think something is good, if I tell myself, "Oh, that's good," then it's that's when it's not. You always have to doubt. It's you have to go on doubting, and then something can be true. And as you were saying, the only way you can tell if something is done is when you just can't do any more to it. But there's no feeling of, wow, I've just done an amazing painting, because then you know you haven't.
Because it's often a surprise when you get back to the studio the next day, because I think I might have said this in the catalogue, think I've had the worst day ever, and then you get in and you're like, oh, I actually quite like that the next day, because it's just, I find it very hard. I don't really step away while I'm working, so there's always that sense of surprise. I say.
With perfect timing.
Was that a different one?
Just to quickly say, sorry, I also think it's good for young artists to know that thing about you know, that it's actually, oh, this is a good thing that you have that doubt and that you don't know and that, you know, it is uncertain and that, you know, I don't know what I was going to say. Sorry.
Thank you. Maybe it's time now to talk about the electric paint exhibition.
Has it been on the thing the whole time?
So in the catalogue to the exhibition, we took your musings in your email exchange about a fantasy exhibition, bringing together paintings that for you had an electric charge, that there was an aliveness to the paint, to the paint surface. And here it is. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you identify the paintings that have that liveness, that have that energy, and maybe the works that you chose to bring together for our fantasy electric paint show.
It's like you said something about like an electric charge between Bacon and Van Gogh. And we kept sort of saying, well, it's so alive. And it is again, this almost uncanny sense of immortal life somehow. Do you think?
Yeah. There's that Rembrandt in the Frick in New York.
Oh, yes, we had that experience when we went to the Frick together just a few months ago when I was in New York.
I almost don't want to talk about it.
No, shall we not?
Sorry.
It was my...
No, sorry. I brought it up. No, Rembrandt has it. But it happened very naturally, the electric paint show, didn't it? Because we just started saying, oh, what have you seen recently? And you'd just seen Van Gogh and Bacon that were on at the same time 2 years ago. And I said, what a great show that would make. And obviously Bacon had often worked from Van Gogh. But we just started talking about people whose paint is alive.
Yes,
And that there are very few, really. We haven't talked about illustration, and it's time to end.
It's not time to... We're okay.
Oh, okay.
We're okay.
Okay. I thought we were doing questions. No, because we quickly led us to, and I think you said, it's such a pity that... And we're not old fuddy-duddies, but you did say something about how the sort of deadening of surface that comes with people mostly looking at art on social media and photographs of art instead of the actual art, and that we were just lamenting that a lot of art looks as if it's made to be photographed rather than to be seen in person. And so our whole electric paint thing was about you have to see something, you have to be there. And a painting is meant to be experienced face to face.
Yes.
I mean, obviously we can't all see every painting, like we can't jump on a plane to Czechoslovakia to see the flaying of Marsyas, but we can see thousands of things in London or wherever we are. I have such a pet peeve about people jumping on planes to go and see things halfway around the world, and then they never go to the Met or the National Gallery. It's like, there's quite a lot of good art here as well. Because, just seeing things in person is so important. And in terms of looking at things, taking time, I always think, how long do you think the painter looked at the thing? Whether it's Rembrandt or Van Gogh or you or Picasso or anyone. You've got try and give it at least the amount of time, because the artist would have obviously looked and looked and looked and looked. And part of what we're getting, that energy, is the energy of not just their paint, but their eyes on it leaves a trace of energy and a sort
really
of
does,
ghosts.
Yeah.
I mean, a painting is a sort of haunted.
And it has to be a shock to see the real thing. If you've just seen images, photographs, it has to, and if it isn't, then there's something not right. Yeah.
And I think it was in your essay, Painting Myself, in your monograph, Celia, that there's a really lovely sentence where you say, paint lives in the present tense always. And I suppose in a way that's saying the same thing. There's something that a painting is continually moving through time with you. There is some aliveness to it through the experience of it being you can see the traces of the movement of the hand, and something else that perhaps is harder to define, but you know it when you see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember saying that a painting is like a handwritten letter, and I think it would be so tragic if we lost handwriting.
Yes.
And I think that's partly why things can be quite bland to do with.
I don't know. Do they still teach handwriting in England? Yes. Do they? Oh, good. Because my daughter, they taught it at her school in America, but a lot of them don't. But, we need another hour then, because we've got to talk about AI and all that. Because we're lucky if people will even still be... Anyway, there's not time for that.
Let's talk about illustration, because one of the topics you do go to town on in your email correspondence is the relationship between, or how does one define illustration versus painting? Can you answer that question?
Well, it's such a complex thing, because in the email exchange, I cited this Degas painting, which I think is called either The Rape or Interior. It's got two titles, where there's a man standing with his back to the door and a woman on the other side of the room looking desolate, and in between there's an open box, and it's got this intense feeling of drama. It's a story, but it isn't a story. It's a mystery, and it's that sense of keeping, just withholding something being explained. I think that it is one of the differences between illustration and painting. That you can't explain away a painting.
There's something beyond words that's communicated visually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing we want, it's not to turn one's nose up at illustration, because great illustration is, great. It's more just that what used to be, I feel like it's sort of been forgotten in contemporary art, and that a lot of the contemporary painting I see, I just think looks like a birthday card, and just think, I don't know, it doesn't seem to be about painting. It doesn't seem to be about anything other than just an image, and it doesn't seem to be about paint. It doesn't seem to be about life. It doesn't seem to be trying to grope at anything that you can't put into words, and that, obviously paint, because you can't put it into words. So if you can just describe something. And in America, there's a massive resurgence of this very academic painting. And you just think, why? What are these people doing? Because to me, most of it just seems like a showing off of skill. And you just think, why do we need this now? Because even when I was at art school, that was seen as very dull. And why would you do that? Because you'd take a photograph if you want to, if you want to just show what something looked like. So there's been this resurgence of, it's very conservative and it's very frightening, and the market is to blame for a lot of it, because it's very easy, you get it all at once, and most of it's really bad. And it's given painting a bad name, again, where, in fact, were we going to make our announcement?
Shall we do it?
Yes. Painting is dead. Yeah, we think it's over. And we were brought up to, fight against the idea that painting could ever die, but it almost seems like we were wrong. And, but, I mean, Bacon, again, the quote that I always loved was that the difference was to convey the, does someone know this by heart? Anyone of my generation? To convey the sensation, to get across the sensation without the boredom of its conveyance, right? Which I think just still says it really so well. And he talked about, why do you care about doing the eyelashes and the fingernails and all that? Because everyone knows a human has all that. Like, you don't need to do... And of course, if you want to do eyelashes and fingernails, there's a place for them too. But just a painting it's got to last forever, but at the same time being instantaneous, right? So that's the energy, that it's striking enough to get you, but has enough longevity to keep you. And that's not what a birthday card does usually.
Okay, I've got one final question. 2 minutes, okay. So another beautiful thread in your correspondence is talking about your relationship to other artists through time. And there's a lovely moment when you talk about dead painters you think might be your friends. And I wanted to ask, what does it mean to be in conversation with artists through time? And is this relationship or this interest in other painters driven by rivalry, envy, or something else entirely? Inspiration?
Well, it's neither rivalry nor envy. It's very difficult. It's a sort of deep connection and an excitement about that connection and a sudden sense of not exactly belonging, but you know, if you do meet somebody and you feel this, almost you can feel an immediate empathy for this person for some mysterious reason. It feels quite miraculous, doesn't it?
Yeah, like chemistry. That's the thing about being in person. So I'm so grateful I wasn't alive for online dating. Because how can you tell if you're not face to face with someone? Because you can, they might tick all the boxes, but I mean, I think everything's about chemistry, whether it's friendship, love, or whether you're drawn to a certain work of art or not. But it's a bit rivalrous for me. I think I'm really competitive, and I am competitive with art of the past, and I know that I'll never win, but I think that does drive me, partly because I can't ever rest on my laurels, or sort of, you know, when people say, oh, take a break, and I just think, how could I, you know, because I look at art that I love, and I just don't think I can ever be anywhere near, you know, the art of the past that I love, and even, you know, recent past too. It's not all just Rembrandt and Velázquez. So, and we both think we're rivalrous with our peers, don't we? But you said, and I think you're right, that's healthy. You want to be, like, I want to go into an exhibition and be like, damn.
Yeah,
because it spurs you on.
Yeah.
It spurs you on if someone's doing really great work, and it's depressing if they're doing bad work.
Right, well, Celia and Cecily, thank you very much indeed. I think this is a good moment to open the floor to questions. Does anyone have any questions? If you do, please raise your hands and a microphone will find its way to you.
Hi, thank you for sharing all this with us. I mean, it was amazing to listen to you. I have a question for Cecily. I see a bit of expressionism and figurativism in your painting. Do you, if it's true, all this, do you start from any of the two? Like, do you go through the painting thinking like of landscape and then it goes expressionism, abstract, or vice versa, come out on the other way around? So you start from the abstract and end up to be a landscape, or and I'll tell you why, because we observe your paintings in the room, and when you're close, obviously there is a lot of colors together. Then we saw them from the very distance, and it was a proper landscape, and says, oh my God, this with the three-dimensional effect, and so yeah.
Well, I usually just start with colour, and I'm guided by colour more or less. And in some of the paintings in the exhibition, I did start with the idea of a specific landscape and this log, which was based on a jigsaw puzzle that my sister gave me, actually. I mean, there's lots. You'll see a lot of the drawings here. Nearly all my drawings are copied from other places, whether it's, you know, in this case, mostly children's books, but also photography, other art, and just anything that I fancied. I draw to sort of learn how to do something. So in this case, I did start knowing what I wanted the image to be. And partly that was in opposition to earlier work where it gets very abstract very quickly, even when I want to kind of hold on to the figure. I always think I want to hold on to the figure and a recognizable subject, but it tends to get away from me very quickly. So a lot of what you see in a finished work is really just the evidence of me trying to pull that figure back in. And that's why, in a fairly sort of dumb way, but there might be a sort of an object or almost one recognizable thing that once you see it, the rest opens up, like a clue that then... So I've never minded the idea that they appear abstract at first, but that the idea is hopefully that once you get involved in looking, that you'll find a lot of allusions and nods to other things and I would like to be a figurative painter. I'm just very bad at keeping the figure there.
I think it's quite successful in that sense.
Thank you.
Because I think both of the feelings, like I see the figure with a landscape or hug between the people, and but you go also like these great colors and.
Thank you.
Thank
well,
you.
I've always found it very hard to do a single figure, unlike you, because I then just stop at the image. So, I mean, a challenge for me is trying to do a single figure, and the closest I've got is in this show with couples and the little couples in a boat. I'm trying to do just a woman in a boat back at home now, so we'll see.
Are there any more questions?
Hi, thank you. Oh, hi, thank you very much for the conversation. Excuse me. It was great. This is more of a question for Cecily, but I think it opens to both of you. Your titles are both very specific and so much ambiguity. Like they don't. I just wondered where in the process that titling comes in. Does it exist before the painting art? And does it change ever with the painting? And it's probably a question that feel a bit bad because Cecily, yeah.
I keep lists of titles for waiting for the right moment for them. And honestly, if the work wasn't going to go into the world, I would probably never title it. It's more for identification purposes, which is a really boring, disappointing answer. I decided very early on, I mean, you can't call things untitled because it's too confusing. And you just sort of think, well, try harder. But I started very early on naming things after existing, whether it was films, books, songs. It was always films and songs and plays to begin with in the 90s, and then I sort of ran out of ones. But it was never meant to be descriptive, and that has come back to bite me sometimes, where people think they read too much into the title and think it's about something to do with that specific film. Oh, we even had that in a review here, didn't we? Because one of the couples in a boat is called Bitter Moon, and I took it from a poem by Beckett, who I love Beckett's poems, but there'd been a really bad movie called A Bitter Moon, and the person reviewing it had read all this stuff into it that related to the movie, and it didn't. But I always Google a title now before I use it to see what else it has been, and sometimes I will discard it if it's been a really bad song or something. But Bitter Moon, I just liked it enough. And I've run out of films, and a lot now I just use lines of poetry. How do you get yours?
Well, some titles just come to me, but very often I actually have to ask Claire quite a, and because I do think a title is important. It can draw you in, but I remember titling something far too poetically. I did this painting of my mother, and she was in front of a canvas back, but sort of like it was this cruciform shape that she was half present and half a ghost behind the cross, and I gave it a far too poetic title, which I'm far too embarrassed even to say, but then I just called it My Mother with Canvas Back, and it seemed perfect. Oh, no, actually, no, I called it My Mother in the Centre of the Canvas. Oh, that's right. Yeah.
I don't mean to say I don't find them important, because once they are in the world, you know, it is important. And so many of them are musical ones. I end up humming the song as I'm looking at the painting, which I also quite like, especially Terry and Julie. We were singing Terry and Julie, we were singing Waterloo Sunset all the time while we were installing, because there was Terry and Julie.
I wanted to ask about what you thought, well, individually. Slade obviously features, you're both Slade girls. Has that education stayed with you? Does education really, really matter? And how do you keep learning? After the institution is gone, how do you keep learning? That's one. And then two, I just wanted to declare that I don't think painting is dead. I think painting is very much alive. Thank you. So the institution, how important was that? And how do you keep learning after you've done with the institution?
I mean, I think one interesting thing is that even though we were only at the Slade 10 years apart, it had shifted quite a lot in that time, hadn't it? Although you did say painting was already not what the cool kids were doing when you were there.
No.
So late 70s, early 80s, and then I was there late 80s.
Yeah, I mean, when I was there, really, there was such exciting performance art happening. That seemed to me the most exciting discipline when I was there, and somehow the life drawing studios, seemed something, I don't know, stiff and anachronistic about it. Somehow they were the opposite of life rooms. They were death rooms, and yet I wanted to learn. So I wanted to learn a discipline. So I in fact did opt for the life drawing myself. But I didn't like being at the Slade at all. I couldn't. I didn't feel free there at all. So I think my freedom came after art school. I was very, very relieved to get out.
And I think freedom's the most important thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think everything I've been driven to do, whether it's... I mean, I was delighted to go to the Slade because I couldn't get into art school for a couple of years, so I was dying to be somewhere, and also to have the acknowledgement that I wasn't wasting my time, so to get into the Slade was enormously important. It was very loose and free when I was there. You really just got on with it. And there was a model every day who you could use or not use. I didn't go in the painting life studio. But it was wonderful. You could draw from the model all the time, but we'd have the model on a swing. And I've always been into short poses, so you could just do... It was very free. It was wonderful. I think the life drawing stayed with me the most, and I'd also done life drawing before I got to the Slade with Maggie Hambling, because when I was failing to get into art school, I went to Maggie's, she had an adult education class, she still has, at Morley College, so I used to go on Thursdays to do Maggie's class, and so life drawing was something incredibly important to me back then, and that stayed with me. But yeah, I couldn't wait to get out of school as well. By the time the 4 years was up, I was just really... I didn't do an MA, nor did you, did you? I think an MA is mostly a waste of money. And especially in America, just because, I mean, in America it's a fortune, and these kids leave with massive debt, and this is all part of the cycle of why they then make very safe work that will sell, even though nothing's selling now. But I think it's all part of the same problem that in America they're really pushed to do an MA, and it's sort of like, you'll make connections there, and they're like little mini careerists, and they're told you've got to go because that's where you can network, and it's all just really unsavory.
Hi, thank you so much. It was a wonderful discussion. Obviously, words are important to both of you, and I wondered if you could each name a writer that's important for you in terms of your work.
Well, I say Proust.
I say Proust. I started reading Proust and never finished, but when I first went to New York and I didn't know anyone, so it was wonderful because I had so much time and I was on my own a lot. Years and years later, and I hadn't realised how much he'd influenced my way of thinking, and then years later I was looking for a title, and I was remembering this passage from Proust, or passages, about the little band of girls on the beach at Baalbek. And that was the sort of impression, that's the thing I wanted to get across in these paintings. And so I went back into my old copy, and I was posting every page, and I realised this actually influenced my whole way of seeing, almost more than anything, of the delving into memory and the...
And the intense, I mean, it's such an intensely visual piece of writing, isn't it? The hawthorn blossoms and just how much everything matters.
Yes. And the time embedded in it.
One more question. Oh, okay.
Hello. Thank you very much for a lovely talk from both of you. I just wanted to ask, how do you feel when a painting that you really love, when you've sold it and it leaves the studio?
Do you want to?
Yeah, no, I thought you were going to say something else.
Oh.
Well, I'll keep things sometimes. So, but you know, one wants them to be seen. I don't like to think of a painting just holed up. I mean, the worst thing is hearing that someone bought something and never opened the crate. I mean, that's the very worst thing that can happen. But so I think. And because I've been lucky enough to have exhibited a lot, so it doesn't really feel complete until that's become so much part of the process, is having eyes on it and getting not necessarily direct feedback, but knowing that it's in the world, and that's sort of like the next part of its life, and you need it to be seen.
I think I'm always very, very glad when they've gone. I mean, I don't like seeing them being carted down the step because they suddenly become objects rather than something you've put your heart into. So I don't like, and I wouldn't like to know that anything had happened to a painting, but I'm so glad when they've gone. And to have an empty studio is the most exciting moment of, to begin again.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much, Celia and Cecily, for a really fantastic conversation.